Well, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Filipa Ramos. I'm a writer and I'm an editor of a publication and communication group called eFlux, where I'm editor of one of its platforms, which is called Art Agenda. And my main area of research, apart from the editorial side, is the relation between art and cinema, and how artists engage with how artists invent and imagine ways for cinema to go beyond its canon and its mainstream circuits, and I'm very interested in comprehending in what ways artists who are in general largely visionaries are imagining the future of moving images and the future of cinema. And I guess that's it mostly.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. My name is Anna Gritz, and I'm a curator at the KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. I only recently started as part of a new team that started in July. Before, I was a curator at the South London Gallery in London. And similar to Filipa, I also have an interest in moving image, but maybe more largely into artistic practices that could be called durational, or that don't always have a natural home in the exhibition space, but that find many different outlets. And I think both for Filipa and mine, we thought that today could be a really interesting moment to look at these practices and find bring our common interest together in artist film and artist moving image and feminist practices, as we both locate in this area practices that have been highly overlooked in the commercial field and in the art fair, and that are also, especially in the field of moving images, are not always so easy to introduce them into the context of an art fair. So we picked a small trajectory of 3 artists that we would like to show you today. And we're going to start with a Viennese artist called Renate Bertelmann, who has been practicing since the 60s and 70s in Vienna. She is a contemporary of Valley Export and kind of other feminist artists of the time in Vienna. From her, we're going to go to an American artist called Lynn Hirschman Leeson, who is of the same generation. They're both born in the 40s, kind of started practicing in the 60s. Lynn has been practicing all throughout now, with a particular focus on moving image and digital practices. And then we're going to end at a contemporary booth in the present future section by Cecile B. Evans, a young female British artist who just was nominated with the Illy Art Prize. So they're all moving images, so I'm just going to preference that it's going to be quite difficult to see the works in their full entirety. So we're going to give you small snippets and introduce you, and then we're going to maybe encourage you to come back and see the full film later on.
Not only to look at what is being presented, but also the criteria for a specific gallery to decide to include these works in the fair. How, for instance, the fact that there are 2 artists from an older generation, both born in the 1940s, who were fairly unknown until very recently, at a certain point start having institutional recognition, start being shown in specific art spaces and in specific museums, and are somehow reframed and represented by the art market and brought into the context of an art fair. So to think about how this happens, how are these criteria for the inclusion and exclusion of artists, how the rediscovery of an artist becomes a fundamental strategy and a fundamental tool for a certain logic of the market, and how it can radically change the economical value of a work. The fact that suddenly they become part of a gallery and they start being sold and start thinking about their work in a way that they haven't until then. Or how a younger artist instead has a large institutional recognition. This work that we're going to see of Cecile B. Evans was a commission for the Berlin Biennial, was one of the most visible works of the Berlin Biennial because it was at the heart of the central institution, which is the art center where Anna is a curator, the Kunstwerk in Berlin. So Cecil B. Evans' work was at the core of the main institution of the Berlin Biennial, and suddenly, very soon afterwards, the Berlin Biennial was just this summer, we have a mini version of the work in a commercial booth. So it's also very interesting to comprehend this constant dialogues and exchanges between the art market and the institutional circuit.
So I'm here with Gloria at the gallery stand of Richard Saltoun, presenting a solo presentation of Renate Bertelmann, the Austrian artist that I just introduced to you earlier. So we see a selection of her work from various times, from the 70s. We see some vinyl works. I'm just going to say one more sentence. So one aspect that we picked out as a key between all the three practices that we want to speak about today is identity construction in female work, or in feminist female practices. And this is really a key kind of early work for this kind of working manner.
Something that attracted us very much in relation to this whole booth was this series of images and the way that they allowed us to reflect on, as Anna was mentioning, on the construction of a female identity and how from a certain moment onwards, specifically in relation to a response to certain medium that allowed for different forms of representation, artists started playing with their representation, started playing with the social projections on notions of female identity, for instance, and how elements like costumes and masquerades and elements imported also from the tradition of theater became incorporated in the construction of these images of this woman and these portraits of this woman, which of course anticipate by decades and decades the whole culture of the selfie, which is so much present nowadays. No, so this same notion of narcissism and the same notion of a self that looks through a camera to look at herself becomes very visible in this variations on the theme that also echo the work of better known artists as Cindy Sherman, for instance, who some of you may be familiar with, becomes very, very clear in this series of images. And of course, this is a defining element for a certain practice that in a period is addressing issues connected to feminism, connected to modes of social and of gender emancipation, but that are also traversing the practice of other artists of the moment. If you think of the early videos of someone like Bruce Nauman, for instance, or even Vito Acconci, you see that this relation with a camera that depicts a photographic camera or a video camera that has the capacity of relaunching these images at a certain speed. Well, video is a closed circuit, so you can be looking at yourself while performing. And here, of course, there's this distance that you need to process the films. But still, this notion of a distorted technological mirror becomes a fundamental element for this construction of a body that is a different body from before.
I just quickly wanted to pick up on the word play that Filipa mentioned, because I think one key element here is that it's a play with identity as well. And I think what Filipa was getting at with the idea of technology, that each new technology became like a new playground for artists to play around with identity. So what we see Renate in different guises, different costumes, but it's nothing elaborate. It's nothing that she had to hire. She didn't have to go to a studio. It was her own domestic background, I assume, or maybe that of her friends. And I think that's a key point for early women's practices, and also maybe a good way to think about why some of them disappeared and are now being rediscovered is that the professionalization of the female artist was just at this point in the 70s or 60s, not at the same stage as we see it now. There were very little role models for artists to imagining themselves as artists that could sustain themselves financially or institutionally. Very little teaching opportunities, very little galleries that represented women. So almost no way to have an independent practice. So this play with the domestic was because it was obviously the main kind of surrounding for women, but also because there was little of an alternative. And that's something, the domestic and the professional realm is something we want to pick up again at the different artist. But then we thought maybe Gloria wants to say a couple of words about Renata as well.
The artist actually received a very strong support by the feminist movement itself in Vienna at those times, in the 70s. And in fact, she was politically active. She wrote for feminist magazines. She noted that she could have found support in spirituality or in politics. In this case, she found the women's movement in Vienna, and that was an extreme support for her, and that also influenced her practice. Her practice is deeply influenced by feminist content. And the artist also started studying at the University of Fine Arts in Vienna, where she found that there were two little women. It was herself and another painter, plus just one female teacher that was relegated into like an underground studio, very tiny space. So she refused to continue painting, and instead, also because of boredom, she found painting quite boring, and she went into studying conservation. And that's why you can see how the materials that she uses are very different. She uses latex, plexiglass, video, all kind of installation drawings, collage, photographic portraits, tableau vivant. So the artist is extremely rich in her practice. She did a turn into her aesthetic approach towards the 80s, where her art became more kitsch. But she used the kitsch in order to speak closer to the people, and as the kitsch taste is like the taste of the people and not of the elite. Yes, I just want to wrap up by saying that the artist is still alive in Vienna, and she's very active and an amazing person.
Here we are at the booth of Walburga Voters, a gallery from Brussels. We are in front of two works of Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, who is an artist who was who's a Northern American artist. She was born in 1941. She's still active. She lives between New York and San Francisco. And just grabbing Anna's consideration on the use of the domestic and the rethinking about the domestic as a site of transformation and a site that can be rethought from the inside. It's also very curious to see how there was this decision to somehow recreate a mini domestic environment in the presentation of these two videos by including this little table and this little decoration with a painted wall that clearly changes the side of the fair, where all the booths tend to be white and very similar, towards a micro environment where one can be seated looking at these monitors and just have a perception that is in a completely different scenario. These two works are two video pieces that she did in the 1996 and 1987, between the 80s and the 90s. In a very different way, they present Lynn Hirschman-Leeson's constant investigation about the relation of the persona, the constitution of the individual, and very early digital technologies. It's very interesting that in one of them, for instance, she is creating this fictional narrative around a character who suffers a disease and is healed by a stream of images and becomes addicted to the stream of images and becomes addicted to the very, very early internet. And we're talking about a work from the 90s. So she is clearly addressing issues that became fundamental for our current relation with the world in anticipating them by decades.
Lynn's work has been really visionary, and you will see a lot of the themes that she's picking up in these works later in Cecile B. Evans' works. One of the key points to come back to the idea of identity is that she really harnesses the ability of the digital to create new identities. The kind of the moment where we log onto the technology and we have to create a screen name or we have to pick an image gives us the the ability to not just play with the physical reality, that a body, a physical body that we're carrying around every day, but to completely reinvent us. But she also picks it up in the way that she makes her films. This is part of a series that's called, I think, Electronic Diaries, where she's telling very candidly about her life into the camera, as if she was doing a video diary. But in doing so, she's telling us a lot of stories about her life as a young mother in San Francisco, mixing various accounts that don't always overlap. She speaks about her identity as an art collector, about her identity as a call girl. She speaks about having no money, having a lot of money, and this kind of multiple accounts and the kind of slightly cheeky smile that she has on her face kind of supports this idea that maybe she's giving us multiple coincidental realities that are not always based on the truth. And the way that she's using the filmic screen by overlaying different screens, having multiple cuts, supports this reading as well.
Confessional, like being in front of the camera and using a camera as a site for confession, which is very closely associated to the diaristic forms of expression in which one is writing about one's own life, and as a mode of also constituting another subject by the act of writing, is something that was very important for whole feminist practices across literature, film, and art. This notion that Simone de Beauvoir said once that one is not born, one becomes a woman. No, and this notion of declaring one's emotions, one's feelings, disclosing one's areas of intimacy is a mode of constructing, of becoming a woman, but not necessarily the woman that the society is expecting one to become. And it's a tool of empowerment, let's say, for a feminist discourse. And here also associating this confessional tone with a very specific montage that is deconstructing a narrative becomes very clear in this.
Taking apart the many ideas that, or the kind of stereotypical ideas that we have of what a woman or a woman artist can be, I just want to speak a little bit about the role of the gallery, for a long time marginalized by institutions as well as galleries. So for a young or small gallery to commit to a practice like this that has no market and no institutional outlets right away is really the groundwork that we would like to see from a lot of galleries. And it's a lot of financial and time investment that then hopefully later on results in a stronger presence. It's maybe a counterpoint to a movement that we see now where a lot of previously marginalized practices are being mined as a potential market outlet, because as Filipa mentioned earlier, a lot of these feminist or women's practices that did not have a market for very long now have one, and the prices for some of these artists rise very quickly. So we have two maybe different narratives that lead to the presence of female artists from this time period at the fair now. And one has to maybe also mention that Artissima has always been a fair that has been very strongly supporting the rediscovery of older practices with the present past section.
We need to go. And here we are in front of the presentation of her video installation, which was called What the Heart Wants. And What the Heart Wants is largely grounded around the construction of a character. So we're talking in the pure age of digital relation with digital techniques, with modes of artificially creating figures, not anymore by the representation of one person, but by the creation through softwares and through pre-existent models for the constitution of bodies. And this character is called Hyper, and is a female figure that, as you're going to see, has no face, has a body that is a body that you can recognize from certain animations. Could be Lara Croft meets an actress meets Beyonce, and there are layers and layers in this work in which it's not only this figure that we see, but also included in the work is the own process of making the work, the discussion between the different animators, the different programmers around how to create this figure, how the budgets that they have, the time that they have is influencing the constitution of this female body. What is this female body doing in this space? What life does she have? What non-life does she have? How she relates to death or non-death, for instance. And it, as an environment, is radically different from the recreation of a domestic sphere that we saw before, and we have an immaculate, abstract, almost corporate set for the presentation of this work.
Cecile is really invested in the idea of feelings, who has feelings and what does it mean to have feelings, and to the kind of digital body as a potential new space for identity construction. So while we are leaving all of our likes and dislikes and images and memories in a kind of abstract digital field, she's wondering if this corporation or this system can at some point assume kind of a life of its own. And in this case, she's asking the question, maybe can it be a female identity? She has many different characters that come together in this quite complex narrative. But I just want to mention a short example of how the kind of physical labor of constructing these digital personas and the kind of identity that we see are very closely linked. So, for example, the body of Hyper that you will see when you enter the film in a second has changed shape many different times over different films that Cecile B. Evans did that dealt with a similar character. And one reason why that is that it's actually, there's a very direct number of how expensive it is to render a body by the programmers. So sometimes when the female is slimmer, it can also just be a sign that there was a smaller budget attached to the film, which I find quite fascinating.
You can see outside there's an indication of the time that is left for the end of the film. And this is actually one of the few sites within the fair where you can be inside without any distraction, and your attention span is invited to delay a little bit, so you can just sit comfortably and watch. I would wait until it all goes, because it makes sense. It's one of these works that makes sense to watch from the beginning to the end. Wait 10 minutes, maybe drop the Walkie Talkies and come back and watch it. And this was a little bit of a rush, but we really hope that you enjoyed it. And thank you for being here.